Rekindling a Dying Marriage. A welcome as we take another look into the life and the message of Elizabeth Elliot. She called us to live to a higher standard, not satisfied with just a little empty religion in life. As our series continues in the coming weeks, we'll hear from various folks, family, friends, and others influenced by the life and message of Elizabeth Elliot. And thanks for joining us again today. Well, as usual, we have two Gateway to Joy programs coming up. One is a question and answer session, and another is about rekindling a dying marriage. They're all part of a 10-part series called Love That's Out of This World. We'll be hearing from Davey Blackburn, an author and speaker, who will talk about the legacy of Elizabeth Elliot. And Elizabeth herself will join us to talk about some advice she has for young people concerning the will of God. First, though, let's get to part 4 of Love That's Out of This World. This is part of a seminar. Elizabeth talked about God's command and his enabling, about a man with a shriveled hand, about a secular mindset, as opposed to thinking as God does. Rekindling a Dying Marriage. Love That's Out of This World, Part 4.
Now the power to love will be given to us if we're willing to do his will. Remember, when God tells you to do something, that his command is his enabling, and he will help us. And the story of the man with the withered hand is in Mark 3. Another time, Jesus went to the synagogue, and a man with a shriveled hand was there. Some of them were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus, so they watched him closely to see if he would heal him on the Sabbath. Jesus said to the man with the shriveled hand, "Stand up in front of everyone." Then Jesus asked them, "Which is lawful on the Sabbath day, to do good or to do evil, to save life or to kill?" But they remained silent. He looked around at them in anger and deeply distressed at their stubborn hearts, and said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." And here's Jesus commanding the man to do the one thing that that man knew was absolutely impossible. What happened? He stretched it out, and his hand was completely restored. And the Pharisees went out and began to plot with the Herodians how they might kill Jesus. Jesus was dismayed at the hardness of the hearts of those Pharisees that were criticizing him for healing on the Sabbath. They thought that what he was doing was wrong, and the man with the shriveled hand thought that what he was asking was impossible. Maybe we have questions like that ourselves at times. What God is asking me to do in this book, for example, when he says, if somebody hits you on one cheek, turn the other cheek. If somebody wants to take away your coat, give him your cloak also. If somebody wants you to walk 1 mile with him, walk 2 miles with him. Is that possible? Not without the grace of God, no, but with the power of God, the grace of God, and the omnipotence of love. Do you love him? Will you do what he says? He says, if you love me, do what I say. The secular mindset infects all of us, doesn't it? It's very, very difficult for us to fight against worldly thinking and to think as God thinks. And Jesus told us that we are to stop thinking the way man thinks and think as God thinks. And that is exactly what he said to Peter when Peter was trying to persuade him not to go up to Jerusalem because that was where he was going to be killed. And Peter said, "This must never happen to you." Omnipotent love impelled him to go to Jerusalem, and he set his face like a flint. And Peter said, "No, Lord, that must never happen to you." And Jesus turned to him with searing words and said, "Get behind me, Satan." This man whom he had just named Peter, because he was rock-like, "Get behind me, Satan. You do not think as God thinks. You think as man thinks." And man wants to save himself, doesn't he? "He that loseth his life for my sake shall find it." And there may be a decision facing you right now that I know nothing about, and you feel as though it's going to be a disaster if you do what you think maybe you should do. What will it do to your family? What will it do to your reputation? What will it do to your marriage? What will it do to your business? Is it a disaster? That's not our business. It is God's business to be in charge of the results of our obedience. And it is our business to do what he says. If you love me, do what I say. That secular mindset can be counteracted when we remember that God's command is his enabling. He enabled the man with the withered hand to do it. A complete reversal of our natural sense of values. The Bible is full of what seem to us to be human paradoxes, and Jesus taught paradoxes. I had a letter from a lady who had come to a meeting where I spoke in Massachusetts. I don't know what the topic was, but I had mentioned Matthew 25:40, which says, "Inasmuch as you've done it for one of the least of these my brothers, you have done it for me." And I mentioned that we married women need to remember that our brother may be our husband in that case. So whatever we do to or for our husbands, we are doing to or for Christ. And this lady had already made up her mind, and her husband had agreed, that they had spent 33 horrible, miserable years together, and there was absolutely no point in going on with it. And so they had decided to get a divorce, and she went out of that meeting that day forgetting everything else I had said except that one verse. "Inasmuch as you've done it for one of the least of these my brothers, you've done it for me." And she got into her car, and she said, "Elizabeth Elliot is out to lunch. She's crazy. It is absolutely outrageous. It is impossible. There is no way that I am going to love this man the way I love Christ, or treat this man the way I'm supposed to treat Christ." She was infuriated. But before she got home, she had said to herself, "I'm going to try it." She walked into the living room. Her husband was sitting as usual, like a mummy, she said, on the sofa, gazing at the tube. And she said, "I hated that scene." But this time I said to him in a gentle voice, "Honey, could I speak to you for a moment?" And for the first time in 33 years, he turned off the TV to listen. Well, then she said, "I didn't know what to say." What do you say if you're talking to Jesus? Well, you say, "Forgive me," don't you? And so I started to say, "Forgive me," and I started to list the ways in which I had offended him. And he stopped me and he said, "Wait a minute." And he said, "I got a list of my own." And he began to reiterate the ways in which he knew he had sinned against her. It was a total transformation, a complete reversal of their natural sense of values, the omnipotence of love. And she wrote to me to say, "Elizabeth, we are now in love as we never were, even when we were engaged." Well, about 2 months later, I managed to track her down by phone. I've never met this lady, but I wanted to use her testimony in one of my newsletters. And so I managed to call her and ask her if she would allow me to do this. And she said, "Yes, of course. If it would help any one person, I'd be glad." So I said, "Well, now 2 months have gone by. How's it going?" She said, "Better than ever." And she said, "You know what? I didn't tell you everything," but she said, "When that man would walk out the door before this transformation, I would say, Lord, please kill him. That's how bad she was. Well, the omnipotence of love. And I told that story in Atlanta, Georgia, and a lady came running up to me afterwards and she said, you told my story. Now, this is not the same lady. She said, I have had almost exactly the same experience. I said the same thing about my husband when he went out the door. And she said, God has done the same miracle in our lives. And I told the story in New Hampshire, and another woman said the same thing. It is not impossible. It is always possible to do the will of God. And don't ever forget it, no matter what he asks you to do. It is always possible to do the will of God. And some of the most difficult decisions that I've ever had to make in my life appeared to me to be disastrous, to be extremely dangerous and perhaps very foolish. And I might be criticized for such foolishness. I can stand here before you today and say, God is faithful. He will not suffer you to be tempted beyond your ability to bear. And what he commands you to do, he will enable you to do. Is he speaking to someone today about love? That impossible person at work, that awful neighbor, that woman on the committee. How did we ever get her on there, and what's she doing there? That wife or that husband or that teenage son that you are just so upset about that you're just embarrassed to even introduce him to people. Ask God to give you that kind of love. Love is powerful, but the love of God has overcome the world. When Christian reached the cross in Pilgrim's Progress, he looked up as his burden rolled off his back and down the hill and into the tomb and disappeared. He looked up at the cross and he said, he hath given me rest by his sorrows and life by his death. He that liveth in love loveth God. God bless you.
That's part 4 in our 10-part series, Love That's Out of This World, Rekindling a Dying Marriage. Well, marriage will also be a part of our next program in just a little bit. Part 5, a question and answer session. Right now, it's author and speaker Davey Blackburn. He talked about the legacy of Elisabeth Elliot.
She lived a long life, a really long life, and my wife passed away, lived 28 years. And I kind of think I hold those two up in comparison, and I go, legacy really speaks to not how old we were when we passed away or how much life we lived, but really what we did with that life that we lived, how we stewarded that. And, I look at Elizabeth's legacy, and while she was alive, she was impacting hundreds of thousands, millions of people. And then now, what I think the only way that you can truly, the litmus test of legacy is when you've passed. Her faithfulness, even though she was human and she was fallible and she made mistakes and she had struggles and she was very honest about that. Her faithfulness through all of that has now cemented this legacy that is going to live in perpetuity, and people are going to be impacted for generations to come because of how she lived her life here on this earth and who she lived it for. And to me, that's just inspiring. I see the same thing with my late wife. Man, she only lived 28 years, but the way she lived those 28 years, people have been so profoundly impacted by her and will continue to be impacted by her. And I feel a responsibility to carry that legacy and steward that legacy so that other people, are inspired by that in the same way that you're carrying and stewarding Elizabeth's legacy. And I think that just inspires me that here today, now, I can't control what's going to happen to me in the future. I have no idea when my last breath is going to be taken. But what I can have agency over is how do I live right now? And that really is the, I think, message of legacy for us.
Author and speaker Davey Blackburn, the founder of Nothing Is Wasted Ministries. Elizabeth will join us later to give us some advice specifically for young people thinking about the will of God. And speaking of advice, it's a question and answer session next about death, about marriage, singlehood, peace.
Would it be too painful to talk about your experience in the loss of Jim Elliot? We would love to hear it. Thank you. I have certainly talked about my losses in my books, A Path Through Suffering, The Path of Loneliness. Quite specifically, I think I talked about it in The Path of Loneliness. I want to say that when Jim died, we had never heard of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's 5 stages of grief. I didn't know I was supposed to go through 5 stages of grief. I grieved, of course. It was a terrible shock. It was not a great surprise because I knew very well that Jim was going into exceedingly dangerous territory. I also knew that both of us had committed our lives totally to Christ, and he could do anything he wanted with us. And so I had a pretty strong suspicion that Jim might not come back. And he and I had sat down and talked about it at great length, very candidly. But I want to say that I do know a shortcut to peace, and that is acceptance. As soon as I got the word that Jim was actually dead, we knew that the men were missing for about 4 days. We didn't know whether they were dead. I remembered the words that Amy Carmichael taught me through a poem, "In acceptance lieth peace." And you can spend your life feeling sorry for yourself and going to counseling and expecting to be hovered over and propped up and surrounded by loving people in the church. I was alone on a jungle station except for my 10-month-old daughter. And I stayed there, as I said. I stayed in Ecuador for 8 years after he died, 7 years. But I couldn't change the fact that Valerie was fatherless or the fact that I was a widow. It is a question of, yes, Lord, behold the handmaiden of the Lord, do anything you want with me. Help me to glorify you in my widowhood. And I just really believe that you don't have to go through the bargaining and the bitterness and the anger and all the rest of the 5 stages of grief. That's not to say that one doesn't grieve. There's nothing wrong with grieving, but it's a far cry from people who go through the rest of life expecting to be felt sorry for. I'm an older single who's never been married and never has had sex, but 20 years ago I experienced heavy petting with a boyfriend. I know if I ever get married that my honeymoon night will be spoiled because I've touched another man. My question is this: shall I tell my fiancé about what I did in the past? Is it deceiving or lying if I don't? Or am I doing him a favor if I don't tell him? I think the latter. I would say don't drag up all the past sins because they are under the blood. Now, if the question comes up, if he puts a direct question to you, then obviously you cannot lie. But I really don't think that we are required to dredge up all our past sins. I'm in the early stages of dating a man that I would marry. At what point in a relationship do single women submit to a man treating him like Christ? Well, there'd be very few areas in which you would need to submit. I certainly would not to submit to just anything that a man might ask you to do. Submission in a case like dating, to me, is acknowledging the fact it is the man who is the initiator, you are the responder. He is the one who is asking you to go out, and he's the one who's making the plans for the evening, probably. He is the one who picks up the tab. Whatever you do, do not offer to pick up the tab if you're on a date. By that, you're really pulling the rug out from under his masculinity, and he needs all the help he can get to keep that in this day and age. And if he wants to take you to a fancy place, but he can't afford the tab and asks you if you can pay for half of it, then I would say, why don't we just go to McDonald's and let him pay for the whole thing? I expect to be treated like a lady, and I can only be treated like a lady if I am treating him as though he were a gentleman. I got saved last summer. I am 9 years old. I loved the meeting. Thank you. Bless your sweet little heart. Pardon this statement if it may appear to be steeped in empty vanity. I am an attractive lady, only by God's choosing. As a result, many men are attracted to me. I am exhausted by their attentions. I'm sure there are many of you that would envy this lady, for I want only the Lord's something for me. Can't read it. I am to the neutral point of wanting God to give me the grace to be single for life. Question: how can I be poised to reject men without rejecting the only one God sends? I don't know an answer to that one either, except pray. And I believe, because of my own experience and many, many others, so many of which are in this book, Quest for Love, God knows how to bring you together with the right person at the right time. And he will enable you to know that this is the right one. It took me a long time to believe that God really wanted me to marry Lars, because I couldn't imagine that God would want me to have a third husband. I really had totally closed my mind to that. So I wasn't looking, I wasn't even thinking about it, let alone looking. So it was quite a job for him to pursue me as he did. Trust God is the answer. I would like to know how you met and decided to marry Lars. Well, he and another seminary student rented rooms in my house after my second husband's death. Number one married my daughter. Number two married me. Now, ladies, you can't be too careful who you let into your house. And when I told that story to a friend of mine in Fort Worth years ago, she had lost her only husband. She was in her 70s. And she said to me, "Well, Elizabeth, I just want to know, how'd you ever get 3 husbands?" So when I told her my story, she said, "I believe I'm going to rent my house out to 3 widowers." How do we find out about a man's character and learn about him as a person if we don't date? Well, read the book, Quest for Love. Observation of character. Observation. And you have to be in some kind of a position where you can watch how this man treats other people. How does he treat older women? How does he treat other men? Is he the kind of guy in the church who will stay around and clean up the mess after you've had a church supper? There are just many, many ways. And I always say churches and colleges are excellent places for observation. And you have to observe character. And I observed a whole long list of things that I saw in Jim Elliot from a distance. I did not have to have any intimate conversation with him. Right now, I'm understanding that God has placed me in a time of loneliness. How do you think I can get through? By acceptance. Say, "Lord, you know that I would not choose to be lonely, but you have ordained that I should experience loneliness. Thank you, Lord. I will accept this." How do you tell someone that they are ruining their witness? I guess you have to be pretty blunt if that's what you think they're doing. Depends on who the person is, whether you have any right to say anything to them at all. How can a young Christian woman be guided toward marriage by her father if her father is not a believer? He is her father, and that is a God-ordained relationship. So even though her father is not a believer and she would not be receiving the same kind of advice, I would certainly say be very careful to listen to what your father has to say, because he loves you. He does not want you to mess up your life. And even if he doesn't like the guy that you might marry because the man is too much of a Christian or he's too religious or something that your father doesn't like, I would ask your father, what does he think about this man as far as his character goes? Is he dependable? Is he courteous? Is he loving? Is he the kind of a man who is going to take financial responsibility? And your father could have some good long talks with that man and ask him all sorts of questions that really don't necessarily have anything to do with the Bible. Please tell us your daily schedule. Lars and I get up very early because we go to bed very early. If you want uninterrupted quiet time, there are many scriptural precedents for getting up early in the morning. My father got up between 4:30 and 5. People would say, "How do you do it?" His answer was very simple. You have to start the night before. And that means you cannot do all the things that everybody in the church tells you you have to do. It means you cannot do all the things you'd like to do, all the things you want to do. What matters most? Is it time with God or time with all these other things? Don't ever use the excuse that you don't have time for personal devotions. The only reason you don't have time to do what God wants you to do is because you've done with that time that He's given you what He didn't want you to do. So we get up early in the morning. We have about almost 3 hours before breakfast. When the phone is not ringing, Lars is in his office and I'm in my study. My quiet time consists in prayer and Bible reading and spiritual reading as well. And then after breakfast, he is in his office or he's running errands. I am in my study. Then I make lunch. We eat lunch and then we go out for a walk. We walk about 2 miles every day. We come back, Lars goes into his office, I go into my study. Then I fix supper. I wash the dishes. Lars goes upstairs to his office. I go upstairs to my study after supper. Can you imagine a more boring schedule? But we love it. We have virtually no social life at all, except when we're on the road like this, when some nice person says, "Would you like to have lunch with us?" That is our social life, and I'm quite serious about that. We cannot entertain, and we cannot accept invitations because we really do not have time to reciprocate. But we're so grateful, just unutterably grateful for the privileges that the Lord has given us.
A question and answer session. That's part 5 of Love That's Out of This World. Hey, do you ever struggle with the will of God? Elizabeth had a quick comment about that, specifically for young people thinking about the will of God.
Constantly, I'm aware of the amazing grace of God. I often say to young people who are anticipating missionary work, the will of God is going to be very different from what you expect. It's going to be a whole lot harder. It's going to be a whole lot bigger. But it is also going to be infinitely more glorious. Trust Him.
Well, as our time comes to an end, thanks for letting us come into your home, your office, maybe along with you as you took that walk, wherever we found you today. On behalf of the Elizabeth Elliot Foundation, in cooperation with the Bible Broadcasting Network, let me invite you to check out elizabethelliot.org. More talks, devotionals, videos, and more. elizabethelliot.org. Because of you and others like you, we've continued to grow. For instance, our YouTube channel has over 70,000 subscribers. Praise the Lord for what He continues to do through His Word. Until next time, may God remind you each and every day, you are loved with an everlasting love, and underneath are the everlasting arms.